Sign the loan docs and this all goes away. Your call, SIS. That was the text my brother sent me at 2:14 a.m. Not a request, not a conversation. An ultimatum. He had filed a false affidavit against my husband in family court 3 weeks earlier, claiming Daniel was physically abusive and that our 10-year-old son Henry was in danger. A child welfare investigation was already open. And at 2:14 in the morning, Trent put it in writing. Sign a $95,000 loan application, or the investigation stays. I read that text twice. I set the phone down on the kitchen table, and 53 minutes later, I sent one email that ended everything. But I need to go back, because this didn't start with that text. It started years before, at a Thanksgiving table, with a 10-year-old boy and a book report he'd written by hand. If you've ever watched someone treat your child as less than they are and said nothing because you were still trying to keep the peace, hit that like button and subscribe. You'll want to hear the rest of this. Thanksgiving 2023, my parents' house in Memphis. The table was set the way my mother always set it. White tablecloth with the lace edges she'd had since I was a girl. The ceramic turkey centerpiece she bought at a craft fair in 1994. Mismatched candlesticks with tapers that had already been lit once before and trimmed down. The smell of cornbread dressing filled the house. Ham with pineapple glaze. Green bean casserole with the French fried onions on top. Sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow crust just starting to brown. The TV was on in the next room. Some football pregame, and you could hear Gene, my father, clearing his throat the way he always did when he was pretending to pay attention to something. Henry had brought something with him. He'd been carrying it in a manila folder since we got in the car. His Charlotte's Web book report, handwritten. Every page in his careful 5th grade print. The kind of handwriting a 10-year-old produces when he's trying his hardest. Each letter deliberate, a few words crossed out and rewritten because he wanted it to be right. He'd been working on it for 2 weeks. He wanted to show his grandmother because she told him once, years ago, that she liked when he read to her. He waited until the plates were mostly cleared. He pulled the folder out from under his chair, where he'd tucked it against his leg. He opened it and held up the first page. "Grandma, I finished my book report. It's about Charlotte's Web. Do you want to hear some of it?" Barbara looked at the pages in his hands. She didn't smile. She didn't lean in. She reached across the table, took the report from Henry's fingers, and crumpled it. Not quickly, deliberately. She crushed those handwritten pages in both fists, then tossed the wadded ball toward the far end of the table. It rolled past the gravy boat and stopped against the serving dish. "He'll never amount to anything with your genes." The table went silent. Gene stared at his plate. His hands were folded in his lap. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. Trent was sitting across from us, and he let out a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite nothing. Henry froze. His eyes went wide, then went straight to me. His lips pressed together the way they do when he's trying not to cry in front of people. His hand found the edge of my sleeve under the table. His fingers twisted the fabric until his knuckles went white. I kept my voice steady. I did not look at Barbara. I did not respond to what she said. "Henry, do you want more sweet potatoes?" He shook his head. He didn't let go of my sleeve. We stayed through dessert. I cleared plates. I washed dishes. I dried them and put them back in the cabinet where they'd been for 30 years. And when the kitchen was empty and everyone had moved to the living room, I walked to the end of the table. The crumpled pages were still there, pushed against the serving dish, next to a napkin someone had balled up. I picked them up. I took them to the counter. I smoothed each page, one by one, pressing the creases flat with the side of my hand. 3 pages, every word still legible despite the wrinkles. I took my phone out and photographed each page, front and back. I made sure the creases were visible in the images. I made sure the date was in the metadata. That night, after Henry was asleep in the back seat and Daniel was driving us home in the dark, I opened my laptop in the passenger seat and saved those photographs to a folder I'd been building for 4 years. It didn't have a name anyone else would recognize. Just a date range. January 2020 through the present. Screenshots, timestamps, text messages, transfer confirmations. Notes I'd written to myself after phone calls, with the date and time and what was said. I added the 3 photographs of Henry's crumpled book report. I closed the laptop. Something inside me shifted that night. Not loud, not dramatic, but I felt it. The way you feel a crack form in a foundation before the wall moves. I didn't act on it. I told myself it was just Barbara being Barbara. I told myself Henry would be fine, that kids were resilient, that I could absorb this the way I'd been absorbing everything for years. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. I need to tell you about the money, because the money is what makes everything that comes next make sense. In January of 2016, my father, Gene, called me on a Sunday afternoon. I was 29. Daniel and I had been married for 2 years. Henry hadn't been born yet. Gene said Trent was behind on rent again, third time in 4 months. He said the car payments were stacking up, his and Barbara's, and that things were tighter than they used to be since he'd retired from the warehouse. He asked if I could help, just for a little while, just until Trent got steady. I set up an automatic transfer that week, $1,800 a month, every month, from my checking account to Gene's. Gene called it temporary. Every year he called it temporary. In 2017, it was temporary. In 2019, after Henry was born, it was still temporary. In 2021, when I paid $2,340 out of pocket for Gene's transmission repair because he said he couldn't cover it and promised to pay me back, it was temporary. He never paid me back. In September of 2022, Trent's electricity was about to be shut off and his phone was already disconnected. I paid $890 to get both restored. In February of 2023, the same thing happened again. This time, it was $1,150. Both times, Trent never called to say thank you. Both times, Gene called to say Trent was grateful but was going through a rough patch. 100 months of transfers at $1,800. That's $180,000. Add the transmission repair, the 2 rounds of utility bills. The total comes to $184,380. I am a 7th grade English teacher at a Memphis public school. I have been for 11 years. I won Teacher of the Year in 2018 and again in 2022. My annual salary is $54,400. Daniel works as a senior project manager at a logistics firm in Memphis. Our combined household income is $132,400. We bought our home 6 years ago for $187,000. It's worth about $241,000 now. We still owe $194,600 on the mortgage. Our equity in that house is $46,400. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with 112,000 miles on it to work every day. The check engine light had been on since the previous spring. I hadn't had it looked at because the month it came on was the same month I'd covered Trent's February utility bill. Meanwhile, when Trent was 27, when I was 32 and already 3 years into those monthly transfers, Gene and Barbara gave him $12,000 as a business startup contribution. Money they told me they didn't have. Money that materialized from somewhere while I was sending $1,800 a month to keep their household running. That business lasted 5 months. Trent cycled through concepts the way some people cycle through gym memberships. Every 18 months, a new idea. Every 18 months, a new reason it didn't work out. The only constant was that someone else was always paying the bill, and that someone was always me. I never told Daniel the full number, not the running total. He knew about the monthly transfers. He knew about the bailouts. But I don't think he ever sat down and added it all up the way I did, late one night, scrolling through bank statements on my laptop with the screen brightness turned low so it wouldn't wake Henry in the next room. $184,380. I stared at that number for a long time. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. I told myself this was simply what family did. March 2024. Trent called and said he wanted to come by. He had something to show me. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a folder of his own. Printed out projections, a rough floor plan, a menu mock-up, a Southern fusion restaurant concept. He wanted to call it Harvest and Smoke. Midtown Memphis location. He'd found a space. He just needed one thing. A $95,000 SBA loan, and the application required a co-signer with stable, documented income. He sat at my kitchen table and slid the folder across to me. He talked for 20 minutes without stopping. Revenue projections, foot traffic estimates, a chef he'd met at a pop-up event who was interested. He was animated, he was confident. He used the word investment 4 times. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain my reasoning. I didn't list the $184,380. I didn't mention the check engine light or the transmission or the utility bills. I just said, no. Trent's face changed. Not all at once. It was like watching a screen refresh. The enthusiasm dropped out of his eyes, and something harder slid into place behind them. "You're serious," he said. "I'm serious." He called Jean from my kitchen. Put it on speaker without asking. Jean's voice came through tinny and strained. He said, "Family backs. Family?" He said he didn't understand why I was making this difficult. He said Cecilia had always had opportunities and that Trent just needed one. Barbara's voice came through in the background, not on the phone, but close enough to be heard. She said I had always been the difficult one. She said it loud enough to make sure I caught every word. I said nothing. I stayed quiet, letting them continue. When Jean finished, I said, "I've given you my answer." Trent stood up. He collected his folder. He didn't say goodbye. The front door closed harder than it needed to. I put Henry to bed that night. I read him 2 chapters of a book about a kid who builds a raft. I turned off his light. I walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the faint sound of Daniel watching something on low volume in the other room. I sat there for a long time. I didn't know what was coming, but something in the way Trent had looked at me when he stood up, something in the flat, calculating stillness of his expression, told me I hadn't heard the last of this. I was right. What came next was worse than anything I could have imagined. Because Trent didn't come after me, he came after my husband, he came after my son, and he put it in a court document. The letter arrived on a Monday, not in the mail, through the school district's internal routing system. A formal notice that a child welfare investigation had been opened based on an affidavit filed in Shelby County Family Court. The affidavit alleged that Daniel Ward was physically abusive toward his wife and son, and that Henry Ward, age 10, was living in an environment that placed him in immediate danger. I read it standing in the hallway outside my classroom during my planning period. Students were changing classes around me, lockers slamming, sneakers on linoleum. Someone laughed down the hall. I read every word on that page, folded it back into the envelope, and walked into my classroom. I closed the door. I sat at my desk. I placed both hands flat on the surface and stared at the whiteboard where I'd written the day's vocabulary words in blue marker. Daniel had never raised a hand to anyone. Not to me, not to Henry, not to a stranger. He was the man who carried spiders outside in a cup because Henry once asked him not to kill them. He was the man who sat on the edge of Henry's bed every night and asked about his day, and actually listened to the answer. And someone had written his name in a legal document next to the word, abusive. I knew who filed it. I didn't have to guess. The timing told me everything. 3 weeks after I said no to the loan. 3 weeks after Trent walked out of my kitchen with that flat, calculating expression. The investigation moved fast. A welfare worker came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon. She walked through every room. She opened the refrigerator. She looked at Henry's bedroom, the bookshelf Daniel had built for him, the desk where he did homework, the solar system poster he'd taped to the wall above his bed. She sat with Henry in the living room and asked him questions while I waited in the kitchen. I could hear Henry's voice through the wall, quiet, careful, honest. He was 10 years old and he was answering a stranger's questions about whether his father had ever hurt him. Daniel was interviewed separately. He sat in the same chair Henry had sat in, and he answered the same kinds of questions. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. When the welfare worker left, Daniel stood in the doorway and watched her car pull out of the driveway, and then he turned to me and said nothing. He didn't need to. I could see it in his face. Not anger, not fear, but something worse. The look of a man who has just been asked to prove he doesn't hurt his own child. That night, after Henry was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I added the welfare worker's name to my documentation folder. I added the date of the visit. I added the case reference number from the letter. I typed notes about what I had heard through the wall. Henry's responses, the worker's questions, the approximate duration of each interview. I saved everything. I closed the laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat in the dark kitchen and felt something I couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the absence of everything I'd been telling myself for 8 years. Every excuse I'd made, every time I'd said, that's just how they are, every monthly transfer I justified as family obligation, all of it had been a story I told myself so I could keep going. And now my 10-year-old son had sat in his own living room and been asked by a government employee whether his father hit him. The house was dark. The refrigerator hummed. The streetlight outside cut through the blinds and thin lines across the counter. I sat there, and I waited, though I didn't know what I was waiting for. At 2:14 a.m., my phone screen lit up on the table. Trent's name, one message. Sign the loan docs, and this all goes away. Your call, sis. I read it once. I read it again. I set the phone down. I stared at the words glowing on the screen in the dark kitchen until the display timed out and went black. Something inside me snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a clean, quiet break. Like a thread that had been holding two halves of something together, finally letting go, and both sides falling away from each other without a sound. For 8 years and 4 months, I had sent $1,800 every month. I had covered transmission repairs and utility shutoffs and never been repaid. I had watched my parents give my brother $12,000 they claimed not to have while I drove a car with a check engine light I couldn't afford to fix. I had sat at a Thanksgiving table and watched my mother crumple my son's handwriting in her fists and say he would never amount to anything. I had swallowed every one of those moments. I had pushed each one down and told myself this was what family did. And now my brother had typed out, in plain text on a time-stamped message, that he had weaponized a court system against my husband and my son to coerce me into co-signing a $95,000 loan. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was sharp. It was clear. At 3:07 a.m., I picked up the phone. I took a screenshot of Trent's text. The timestamp was visible, 2:14 a.m., April 14th, 2024. I opened my email. I typed one sentence. Sandra, see attached. I need you to move on this immediately. I attached the screenshot. I read the sentence once. I pressed send. The confirmation appeared on screen, a small animation, the message sliding upward and away. Gone, delivered. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. I did not pick it up again until morning. I went to the living room. Daniel was asleep on the couch. He'd fallen asleep watching something with the volume on low, the way he did when he was trying not to wake Henry. I pulled the blanket from the back of the couch over his shoulders. I stood there for a moment in the blue light of the muted television. Then I went to bed. Sandra Mitchell called me the next morning at 8:41 a.m. I was in my car in the school parking lot 10 minutes before first period. She said she'd already reviewed the screenshot. She said the text was, in her exact words, the most self-incriminating thing a litigant has ever handed me voluntarily. She said she'd have the motion to dismiss drafted by end of business, Wednesday. She asked me to forward everything in my documentation folder. Every screenshot, every time-stamped note, every transfer confirmation, every photograph. I sent it all during my lunch break. 4 years of records. The 3 photographs of Henry's crumpled Charlotte's web pages, with the creases still visible. The bank transfer history showing 100 monthly payments of $1,800. The $2,340 transmission receipt, the $890 and $1,150 utility payments, text messages from Jean repeating the word temporary in 2017, 2019, 2021, 2023, all of it. Sandra built the motion around the 2:14 a.m. text. She laid out the timeline, the loan request in March, Cecilia's refusal, the false affidavit filed within 3 weeks, and then the text that connected all 3 points into a single line of coercion. She documented the $184,380 in financial support to establish the pattern. The protagonist had been the family's financial backbone for nearly a decade, and the affidavit was filed only after that support was denied. She entered the photographs of Henry's book report as pattern of hostility evidence against the family. She included the anonymous letters that had been sent to the Memphis City Schools Board of Education, letters claiming I had anger management issues in the classroom, and she noted that Superintendent Walter Brooks had already opened his own administrative inquiry into their origin. The hearing was held the same week. Sandra presented the motion. She read the text aloud in the courtroom, every word, the timestamp, the sender, the specific language. Sign the loan docs and this all goes away. Your call, sis. The judge's response was immediate. He looked at the text projected on the courtroom screen, looked at Trent's attorney, and then delivered a ruling from the bench. His words, as Sandra later read them to me over the phone, "This is one of the most brazen admissions of bad faith I have seen in this courtroom." He dismissed the investigation. He referred Trent's false affidavit for perjury charges under Tennessee's false swearing statute, up to 2 years per count. And based on the documented phone call Jean had made to Superintendent Walter Brooks, A call the district's own phone logs confirmed. A call during which Gene told Brooks he was supporting his son's concerns. Gene was named in the filing as a co-conspirator. Sandra called me at 4:22 p.m. to read the ruling aloud. I was sitting in my classroom. The last student had left 20 minutes earlier. The hallway was empty. My door was closed. Through the window, I could see the parking lot and the late afternoon shadows stretching across the pavement. I kept my voice steady. "Thank you, Sandra." I hung up. I set the phone on my desk. I picked up my red pen. I pulled the next essay from the stack. A seventh grader's analysis of a poem by Langston Hughes, and I read the first paragraph. I wrote a comment in the margin. I moved to the next essay. My phone buzzed 14 minutes later. Gene's number. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again. Barbara's number. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed 3 more times in the next hour. I didn't look at the screen. I graded 11 essays. I stacked them neatly, put them in my bag, turned off the classroom lights, and drove home. Over the next 2 days, the calls multiplied. Gene called 9 times. Barbara called 7. Trent called 4. Each call went to voicemail. I didn't listen to a single one. On a Tuesday evening, 7 days after the ruling, the doorbell rang at 6:47 p.m. Daniel and I were cleaning up after dinner. Henry was in his room reading. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Trent, standing on the front step, looking like he'd been dragged through the last 2 weeks. His shirt was untucked and wrinkled. His jaw was unshaved, not styled stubble, just neglect. His eyes were red-rimmed. He was holding his car keys in one hand, turning them over and over between his fingers. I opened the door. I kept my hand on the door frame. I did not step aside. "You need to call this off," he said. His voice was hoarse. "You need to talk to your lawyer and tell her to pull that filing." I said nothing. "This is insane, Cecilia. Over a loan application? You're going to let them charge me with perjury over a loan application?" I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I'm your brother. Dad could go to jail. Do you understand that? He made a phone call. One phone call. And you're letting them drag him into this." I said nothing. His voice cracked. Not dramatically, just a small fracture along the edge of a word. "I didn't think it would go this far. I was trying to get your attention. You wouldn't listen. You never listened to anyone in this family." I looked at him. I looked at the red rims of his eyes and the wrinkled shirt and the keys he couldn't stop turning. I looked at my younger brother, who had typed out a text at 2:14 in the morning telling me to sign a $95,000 loan or he'd keep a false investigation open against my husband, who had filed a document in court putting the word danger next to my son's name, who had sent anonymous letters to my employer trying to destroy my career, whose parents had called my superintendent and crumpled my child's handwriting and laughed. "This conversation is over, Trent." 8 words. He opened his mouth. I closed the door. Softly. No slam. Just the quiet click of the lock sliding into place. I stood in the entryway for a moment. Through the door, I could hear him standing on the step. Then his footsteps, down the walkway, his car door, the engine. I walked to the kitchen. I picked up my phone. I opened my contacts and went through them methodically. I blocked Jean's number. I blocked Barbara's number. I blocked Trent's number. I opened the family group chat, the one Barbara had created 3 years ago, the one where she posted pictures of meals she'd cooked and Jean shared weather forecasts and Trent occasionally sent a thumbs-up emoji. And I removed myself. I opened my voicemail, 16 unplayed messages. I deleted every one of them without listening. I didn't do it in anger. I did it in clarity. Each tap was deliberate. Each removal was final. When I finished, I set the phone face down on the counter. The house was quiet. Daniel was drying the last dish. Henry was reading in his room. The refrigerator hummed. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something so unfamiliar it took me a moment to recognize it. Relief. Just relief. Like breathing after being underwater so long I'd forgotten I was holding my breath. The weeks following the ruling moved differently. Not faster or slower, just differently. The weight I had been carrying for 8 years and 4 months wasn't there anymore. I noticed it in small ways, the way I stood at the whiteboard in the morning without that low hum of dread running underneath everything. The way I sat at the kitchen table after dinner and didn't instinctively check my phone for messages I'd have to absorb. The way I slept through the night, the whole night, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Daniel noticed it before I did. One evening, a few weeks after I'd blocked the numbers, He was standing in the kitchen doorway holding 2 mugs of tea. He didn't say anything about the family. He didn't ask if I'd heard from them. He just handed me the mug and said, "You look like you're sleeping better." I was. Henry noticed too. Not the specifics. I hadn't explained the legal details to a 10-year-old, and I wasn't going to, but he noticed the quiet. He noticed that Sunday afternoons didn't involve long, strained phone calls anymore. He noticed that I didn't come home from holiday meals looking like I'd been drained of something essential. He noticed that the house felt like our house again, not a holding room between obligations. One night, about 6 weeks after the ruling, Henry was doing his homework at the kitchen table while I graded essays across from him. He looked up from his math worksheet and said, "Mom, are we going to Grandma's for the 4th of July?" I kept my voice steady. "No, we're going to do something just us this year." He looked at me. He looked back at his worksheet. Then he nodded, and something in his shoulders loosened. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He didn't need to. 3 months after the ruling, the information started reaching me. Not because I sought it out. I never called anyone for updates. I never drove past Trent's apartment. I never searched his name. But Memphis is not a large enough city to contain a family's collapse without the sound carrying. A colleague at school mentioned it first. Casually, at a department meeting, the way people mention things when they don't know they're stepping into something live. She'd heard from a friend who worked in commercial lending that an SBA loan application for a restaurant concept in Midtown had expired without a co-signer. The applicant didn't have anyone else to sign for him. The concept was called something about smoke. She couldn't remember the exact name. She said it like it was a curiosity, a piece of local business gossip. I said nothing. I picked up my pen and wrote a note about next week's reading assignments. Harvest and smoke never opened. The $95,000 loan died when the application expired. Without Cecilia Voss's signature, Trent had no eligible co-signer, no stable income to attach, no documented reliability. The landlord for the Midtown space leased it to someone else by August, a bakery, I heard later. Trent's perjury referral advanced through the fall. His attorney, a public defender because Trent couldn't afford private counsel, told him the 2:14 a.m. text left almost no room for defense. The message was time-stamped. It was written in his own words. It directly linked the affidavit to the loan. There was no interpretation that made it anything other than what it was. The charges remained pending. Up to 2 years per count under Tennessee's false swearing statute. Not a conviction. Not yet. Not within the time frame of this story, but the weight of it settled over Trent's life, the way weather settles over a valley. Slowly, and then completely. Jean's exposure followed its own path. Sandra Mitchell's filing had named him as a co-conspirator based on his phone call to Superintendent Walter Brooks, the one the district's own call logs confirmed, the one where Jean said he was supporting his son's concerns. Jean had not filed an affidavit. He had not signed a legal document. He had picked up a phone and made a call, and that call aligned him with everything Trent had set in motion. The statute didn't require a signed document. It required participation. Jean participated. Meanwhile, Walter Brooks's administrative inquiry had been running on a parallel track. The anonymous letters that had been sent to the Memphis City Schools Board of Education, the ones claiming I had anger management issues in the classroom, had arrived in FedEx envelopes. Brooks's office traced the shipping records. The originating location was a FedEx facility 0.4 miles from Trent's apartment. The trace results were forwarded to Sandra and documented in the ongoing file. Every thread Trent had pulled was being gathered and tied together, and each one led back to the same address. Barbara's role unraveled without ceremony. She had been prepared to serve as a character witness in support of Trent's affidavit, to sit in a courtroom and testify about her concerns for Henry's welfare. Sandra entered the photographed Charlotte's web report into the record as pattern of hostility evidence. 3 pages, handwritten by a 10-year-old, crumpled deliberately by his grandmother at a family dinner table, smoothed and preserved by his mother the same night. The creases were visible in the photographs. The metadata confirmed the date. A woman who had crushed her grandchild's schoolwork in her fists and declared he would never amount to anything could not credibly testify about concern for that child's safety. Barbara did not testify. Her role as a witness was abandoned entirely. 6 months after the ruling, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, a woman who went to the same church as Jean and Barbara, that Trent was working deliveries. Not for a company he'd started, not as a stepping stone to the next concept, just deliveries. The kind of work where you drive your own car and track your own mileage, and there's no benefits package and no office and no pitch deck. The same acquaintance mentioned, without prompting, that Jean and Barbara's house felt different now. Quieter. She said Barbara hadn't hosted Sunday dinner in months. She said Jean had started driving for a rideshare service at 64 with a repaired transmission that his daughter had paid for 3 years earlier with $2,340 he never returned. She said people at church had noticed the change. People whispered, "I didn't ask for more. I didn't need more. I heard it the way you hear rain on a window." Aware of it, but not standing in it. Jean and Barbara stopped calling after the 15th voicemail went unreturned. I know the number because Sandra tracked it for the file. 15 messages I never listened to. 15 attempts to reach a daughter who had been reachable every day for 8 years and 4 months, who had answered every call, covered every bill, smoothed every crisis, driven an aging car with a warning light she couldn't afford to fix, and who had finally, at 3:07 on a dark April morning, stopped. The monthly transfers had ended the week of the ruling. I canceled the automatic payment. One tap. Confirm. The $1,800 that had been flowing out of my account every month since January 2016 simply stopped. I don't know what Jean and Barbara did to cover the gap. I didn't ask. It was no longer mine to carry. Spring 2025. 1 year after the text. 1 year after the email. 1 year after a judge looked at a screen in a courtroom and called what he saw one of the most brazen admissions of bad faith he'd ever encountered. Henry's elementary school held its annual literary showcase on a Wednesday evening in April. The gymnasium had been converted. Folding chairs in rows, a podium at the front with a microphone adjusted to 5th grade height, poster boards lining the walls with student artwork and writing samples. The PTA had set up a table with cookies and lemonade near the entrance. Parents filed in and found seats. Teachers stood along the sides with clipboards, smiling the way teachers smile when they're watching their students do something brave. Henry was the 4th reader. He walked to the podium carrying a folder, not manila this time, but blue, the kind with the clear plastic cover. Inside were 4 pages, his Charlotte's Web book report. Not the original. The original had been crumpled at a Thanksgiving table by a woman who said he would never amount to anything. These were new pages, every word reconstructed from memory, then revised, then expanded, then polished over 4 months of quiet, steady work at the same kitchen table where his mother had sent one email that changed everything. He adjusted the microphone. He opened the folder. He looked out at the audience, rows of parents, siblings, grandparents, teachers, a room full of people who had never once tried to tear him down. He read. His voice was clear, not loud, not showy, just clear and steady, the way a 10-year-old's voice sounds when he trusts the room he's standing in. He talked about Charlotte and Wilbur and the web, and what it meant to make something for someone else, something made with care, even when you wouldn't be there to see it last. He read the final line, a sentence he'd written himself, not copied from the book. And then he looked up. He found my face in the 3rd row. I was sitting with my hands in my lap. Daniel was beside me. Henry looked at me, and I nodded. Once. He closed the folder and stepped down from the podium. The room applauded. He walked back to his seat. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look away from the path in front of him. On the drive home, the windows were down. April air. Memphis in spring, warm and heavy and green. Henry was in the back seat with his blue folder on his lap. I was driving. Daniel was beside me. The streetlights passed in a steady rhythm. Henry said, from the back seat, in a voice that was quiet and certain, "I'm glad we don't have to pretend anymore." I kept both hands on the wheel. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it in his voice. Not sadness, not relief exactly, but the clean, settled sound of a child who knows the truth and isn't afraid of it. Daniel put his hand on my arm, just for a moment. Then I put mine back on the wheel. The cut was clean. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's protection. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Loyalty earns its place, and family isn't a title you inherit, it's a relationship you maintain with respect. That was the only legacy I gave Henry, the knowledge that he was worth protecting, and that the people who love you don't ask you to pretend. If you enjoyed this story about protecting your children and knowing your worth, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.